Chapter 1. Interpreting the Meaning of the Holocaust. The Holocaust brings up for examination things we never would have considered unless they had been forced upon us through having to experience or be in close proximity to the painful event. When something of this proportion takes place in history, the interpretation of it, or the lack of an interpretation, is enormously consequential. The most tragic thing would be that the event itself should not be properly understood in the way that we believe God intended. And this is what we propose to examine. I visited Dachau concentration camp in the early 1950s as an indignant, self-righteous Jew with a fervent hatred for the Germans. The camp was in very much the same condition as it had been during the war years. So there was something still of the grim reality of whipping posts and electric barbed wire. It was a horror. The stench of death was still there. I saw the stark reality of the remains of the victims. Their bones and ashes had been left in the ovens. After 8 years, there were refugees still living in the camp. I remember putting my hand on the smokestack to somehow bring home the reality of it. Something blew in me. I could no longer go on with the naive view of, in quotation marks, good guys and, in quotation marks, bad guys. I was being exposed to the grit of reality beyond my conceptual ability to understand it. Up to that moment, I had been convinced that I understood the Holocaust because I was always deeply concerned about it. But now I was touching a horror that eclipsed those naive categories. The Holocaust was a shocking assault on every belief that the 20th century was an age of progress, of human betterment, or any other thing for which men had hoped, all the more since the architects of the Holocaust were considered to be the most enlightened nation on the earth. This not only plunges, but also twists the knife in right up to the hilt. If it had been perpetrated by an obscure and primitive nation, we could more readily understand it. Germany, however, confronts us with an ultimate contradiction, and for those willing to peer into that contradiction, some of the greatest depths of revelation about the human condition and about God are reserved and waiting. Let me read that again. Germany, however, confronts us with an ultimate contradiction, and for those willing to peer into that contradiction, some of the greatest depths of revelation about the human condition and about God are reserved and waiting. World Jewry was so devastated, stunned, and traumatized by the Holocaust that for about 20 years after the event, they produced no serious writing about it. It was only more recently that we could bring ourselves to go back and examine what happened. Some writers have suggested that the Holocaust cannot be critiqued or understood, that it lies beyond man's capacity to understand. And if that is true, then it is even more tragic. Could it be true that something can take place in history of such a magnitude that mankind must simply conclude that it cannot be interpreted nor be understood and therefore just have to be rendered meaningless? If so, then this allowance makes way for something to come into mankind that itself is devastating. This supposed inability to understand such events robs us of sanity and value. It permits the increasing scandal of an amoral society capable and accepting of, in a sense, any kind of violence and mayhem. It makes of life a chaos without meaning, without order. I'm sorry, the way he wrote it was, it makes a life of chaos without order, meaning, or purpose. We insist that, however painful the task is, respect for the victims demands an attempt to understand, to interpret, and to assess the Holocaust. Not to deeply examine it could be called a form of criminal neglect. To ignore it or to be satisfied with a superficial explanation is, in a certain sense, to sign our own death warrants. It is one thing to try and find an explanation in a world without God, but how much more painful for us to find an explanation within the framework of the existence of God. This is a quote from a book by Ulrich Simon, A Theology of Auschwitz. The lasting significance of Auschwitz for humanity lies in its disclosure of the human condition as something incomprehensible and insoluble in merely human terms. Auschwitz discounts the theology of earthly evidence and demands the disclosure given from above. End of quote. The writer is saying that any interpretation of the Holocaust requires a view and an explanation beyond what humanists can provide. It eclipses their categories and requires a view from above, i.e., a divine explanation. The Holocaust is calculated to drive men to a place where their own intelligence, sociology, historical analysis, and critique cannot find an answer. It is not a new phenomenon except in its magnitude and contemporary horror. Its radical evil reveals hitherto concealed dimensions of the demonic and satanic, and it requires us, as Jews, to bring into consideration dimensions of understanding of the spirit realm that are uncomfortable for a rational, secular mindset. Our traditional concept of God and whatever trust and faith we had in him was dealt such a death blow in the Holocaust that it is questionable whether we have recovered from it to this day. Either there was no God, or God was so profoundly present that to burrow in to understand the seeming contradiction would open for us a revelation of God beyond what we have previously understood about him. God is either going to be rejected because he cannot be understood as men have held him to be, or men are going to probe and come into a perception of God that eclipses anything we have previously known as God. It is the one or the other. We must either lose our traditional faith or discover the prospect of a depth of authentic faith. The whole way in which we view a phenomenon reveals our mindset and way of perceiving reality. If we relate to God on the basis of our abstractions and our imagined suppositions, then we are in a place of unreality, not only with regard to God, but also with regard to everything else. God is the ground of reality, not what we think of him to be or what we would ascribe to him, but what he has demonstrated his character to be, especially in the hard dealings with his own people and in the mercies that follow. What a remarkable lesson the Holocaust is for time and eternity. In it, there are depths to be learned that could have not been provided in any other way. How many of us Jews have ever heard a word about God in a way that required us to solemnly consider him, or that implied he could be known and understood as a creator, or that he had something to do with our Jewish history and calling as a people? God's indictment against us is that we perish for a lack of knowledge of him. Hosea 4, verse 1 and 6. How many of us are outside the biblical perspective of the prophets and the Deuteronomic covenantal blessings and curses? Got to read that again. How many of us are outside of the biblical perspective of the prophets and the Deuteronomic covenantal blessings and curses? Aren't we rather a secular-minded people? How equipped are we as a people to examine our calamities in God's light? Little wonder that we are quick to blame Hitler and the German people, or ultimately even God himself. End of chapter 1.